I have a Minolta MD Celtic 28mm f2.8 lens here that I'm going to be fully disassembling. The Celtic line of lenses that Minolta made are MD lenses that were cheaper. They generally use cheaper body designs and sometimes, like on the 50mm and 135mm, which they also made Celtic versions of, they also used cheaper internal designs, and I believe that they may have used cheaper coating on the glass as well. This lens in particular, the 28mm, is actually a lot more repairable than some of the other Celtics, and it's almost identical to the 28mm MC W.Rokkor-X here that I have previously disassembled. So these two lenses internally are almost identical, but you can see externally that the Celtic line does look a little bit different, and it looks a little bit different than the MD 28mm lens as well. It's a cheaper external design, where the MD, just the regular MD lens, has a little bit more intricate external design. I'm going to be fully taking this lens apart to get access to the diaphragm, optics, mechanical components, and body sections, mostly on their own. To start off, I get access to the back of the diaphragm by going in through the back of the lens and removing this back optical piece. So there are two little divots for a spanning wrench, here and here. Okay, so remove this back optical piece. Now I have access to the back of the diaphragm. To get access to the front of the diaphragm, I have to go in through the front of the lens and remove this front optical piece. So we'll start by removing the name ring, which has two little divots for a spanning wrench on either side, here and here. But because they are kind of recessed down inside the lens, you'll probably have to use a pointed tip spanning wrench, much like on the MC Rokkor-X 28mm. So I'll use the pointed tip spanning wrench to get that started. Okay, now you can see the front optical piece here, and then the filter ring holder, this black ring going around on the top of the lens. So next, I'll remove the filter ring holder, which is held in place by the 4 screws that are on top of the black ring, so the ones here, 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 and here. The piece just lifts right out. And removing that piece gives us a little better access, if I focus in all the way here, a little better access to remove the front optical piece. Like on the MC Rokkor, it just screws in place, but you may have to use a spanning wrench on the edge sections here. There are two little divots on either edge right here that you can kind of get a spanning wrench into. If you go in from the side, so kind of like this, you can get a spanning wrench in there to undo this. But since I already loosened it up a bit, I'm just going to unscrew this piece. And now have access to the front of the diaphragm as well. And one nice feature that this lens shares with the MC W.Rokkor is that you can remove the diaphragm. It's not integrated like on a lot of the MD lenses, and especially on the MD, the later cheaper MD lenses, where the diaphragm is integrated into the focusing mechanism. So this entire diaphragm can be removed. So to do that, I'm going to remove the 4 screws going around here, which are holding in place this kind of brass colored washer. Right, so I'll remove this washer, set that aside. Now I can just lift the diaphragm mechanism out of the lens, and it's nice and separate on its own, so you can clean this much better. One minor difference, I believe, that the MC W.Rokkor, that the diaphragm is not held automatically open on its own, this diaphragm piece, whereas this one does have a little spring in here that holds it automatically closed to the minimum aperture by default. But otherwise, you should be able to clean it exactly the same way. Just you'll have to unhook this little spring system, the little wire back here, if you do take apart the diaphragm. And the way that the diaphragm can be taken apart, if you're not content with just cleaning it in the current housing, is with the 3 little slotted screws going around here on the exterior of the diaphragm, and then you can lift out this plate. And then the blades will come out. There's a second plate behind it, which is what this little post is attaching to. And then you can reassemble. You can clean the blades outside and then reassemble the diaphragm and slide the whole thing back in. Continuing on with the lens disassembly, I'm going to flip over the lens now and start going in from the back. First off, on the back section, I have to remove this black ring going around here. This part of the mounting plate. And that is held in place by 3 little slotted screws going around here. So undo these. You don't need to undo them fully, just loosen them up a little bit. And this ring will slide right off. And now we can see the aperture control ring in here, going around here. But you can't lift it off at this point. It's identical and it's set up to the MC W.Rokkor 28mm in that the focusing curve over here, so this piece, and if I flip that over, the piece you can see right down here, the focusing curve, is going through from the aperture control ring into the center of the lens. So you can't actually lift off the aperture control ring at this point. But one thing that you can do at this stage is actually separate the aperture control, this body section down here that has the depth of field scale and the aperture control and the mounting plate from the top section up here, which has the focusing ring. You can also do this on the MC W.Rokkor-X because they have the same setup internally, but I'm going to take this one apart slightly differently and do the separation now with the aperture control ring still on, just to show how that's done. So if you look at this aperture control ring, when I rotate it around, I'm going to set it to be fully open at 2.8, and you should be able to see in 3 of these little slots are little screws going around here. And then there's this 4th slot up here which doesn't have a screw currently visible. But if I rotate it over a little bit, so now I'm at like midway between 7 or so, there is a screw visible up here. So I want to find the spot, the location for the aperture control ring where this screw up here, the 1 screw, is visible, and I'm going to undo that first and then just remove that, get that screw out of there. Then I'm going to turn back to get the other 3 visible and undo each of these as well. Okay, and now that does separate the focusing ring up here and the focusing mechanism on the inside from the back section here, which still has the 3 little screws in there. So, get those out. And this has all the mechanical pieces now fully exposed, so you have the aperture control curve and all these little springs and things down here. The main reason you would ever want to take the lens apart in this order, where you're kind of skipping past taking off the aperture control ring, is that it makes it easy to access the mechanical parts in here. So if you know that there's like a problem with maybe friction on one of these bars in here, or one of the springs is loose, or you just want to get access to the focusing mechanism on the inside, you can skip past taking the aperture control ring actually off and just take it apart this way. But there's not a lot of benefit if you're going to be taking the whole lens apart anyways. So I'm going to set aside the focusing ring here for a moment and just continue on with the deconstruction of this component and actually remove the aperture control ring now. So on the back section here, I have to remove this aperture control curve, which is held in place by the 2 little screws here, on this silver section. So I'll loosen these up a little bit. You don't need to fully undo them. And now, looking at the other side of the lens, I'm going to take the stop-down lever and push it over, and then move this little curve out of there. And now I can remove the curve. And now if you try to remove the aperture control ring at this point, unlike on the MC lens where that aperture control curve was the only thing holding it in place, you cannot actually remove it at this stage because there is also this little metal bar over here. And this little metal bar is also going onto the inside. You can kind of see it right there. There's a little post on the inside that's jutting in. And what this bar does is actually limit how far you can turn the aperture control ring in this direction. So to fully remove the aperture control ring, I'm going to flip this over, find this metal bar, and loosen up the 2 screws here and here that are holding it in place. These have to be fully removed actually. So I'll remove these. Now that little bar should fall out. So there's the little bar, and I'll set this aside. And now I should be able to lift up the aperture control ring. The only other piece that you have to worry about here is the little ball bearing that provides the clicking sound as it moves back and forth. So I'll be careful not to lose that So I'm taking this apart. Okay, so there's the little ball bearing right there, and then the aperture control ring. And now, just to complete the disassembly, I'll take off the final external section here of the focusing mechanism, so the focusing ring that you actually grip onto, so that it can be cleaned on its own. Once you do this, you have to zero the lens back to infinity properly. But if you do need to clean the focusing ring, it's a lot easier to take this off than to have to worry about getting water or damaging the focusing mechanism while you're cleaning it. So to remove the focusing ring, it's just held in place by 3 little screws going around here. So I'll loosen these up, or actually undo them, and they each have little washers as well. Now I can just lift off the focusing ring here so that it can be cleaned on its own, and I have the focusing mechanism right here separate as well. So that has the disassembly of this lens complete. Have things like the optics separate, and they can be disassembled the same way as on the W.Rokkor, where you can remove the individual rings to clean inside the individual elements. But I would only recommend doing that if there's serious fungus or debris or something inside that's impacting image quality. Separate from things like the diaphragm here and mechanical components. Also separate from the body sections like the focusing ring here and the mounting plate ring and the aperture control ring, so that those can all be cleaned on their own. The reassembly is also pretty straightforward, almost identical to the MC W.Rokkor-X. The only difficulty is lining everything up in the mechanical mounting plate section in this piece, getting those 2 bars back in place properly and making sure that everything's lining up correctly can be a little bit challenging. And that's just one extra complication over the MC W.Rokkor-X 28mm. I'm also going to reassemble this using by putting back together the back mounting plate and then reattaching it to the focusing mechanism the same way I took it apart, which is different than how I took apart the MC W.Rokkor-X 28mm in the other video. But you can do the same strategy of attaching the focusing mechanism first and then reassembling it for either of these lenses. So the 2 strategies you can use either one depending on how you need to disassemble and reassemble the lens. So to get started with the reassembly of the mechanical back section of the lens where the mounting plate goes, I'm going to start with getting the aperture control ring in place. So the aperture control ring just slides onto this ring back here so that the numbers line up with this little indicator here, and so all these notches and things are sticking back towards the mounting plate on the aperture control ring. So when it's lined up, it should slide between the 2 indicators on here. And to get this started at first, I just have to get the aperture control ring itself attached onto the lens with the little ball bearing, and then we'll get the 2 different metal plates in place as well. So for this first step, I'm going to take the little ball bearing here, and it has to go into a pocket on the aperture control ring. Let me find where it is. It has to go into this pocket right here on the aperture control ring, and then that pocket is pressed up against the little grooves on here on the main body section, and that's what creates the clicking sound. So because this ring is pretty stiff, the easiest way to get it in place is to line this up first so that the numbers are in the correct position over here. And then I'll find where the little pocket was so it's right over in this section. And while it's just slightly above, so it's still visible right there, I'll put the ball bearing in place. And kind of press it up against the side of the lens. Get it slid down there, so that now when I rotate it back and forth, it should be making the clicking sound as well. Now we have to attach the 2 bars that are going into the inside of the lens. First is this little one here, and then the aperture control curve. So this little bar here is going to attach into the 2 screw holes right here, and it goes in this orientation, like this. So to get this started, I'll just drop this into the correct position. I'll line it up with the 2 screw holes here. And it should be going into the inside of the lens with the little part knob there. And then I'll get these 2 screws started. Because the holes where this is attaching are longer, this does allow you to adjust how the aperture control ring works a little bit. So before, what this is actually doing on the inside of the lens is it's limiting how far it can turn in the direction of the maximum focus over here, because it's hitting against the little bar over here is hitting against this wall. So by adjusting where it's reattaching, you can adjust how far it can turn in this direction. So I'm going to kind of set it midway in between in the slots that the screws are going into for this copy. And next up, we have to get the aperture control curve in place. Remember, we left the 2 screws for the aperture control curve on the aperture control ring here and here. And the aperture control curve has to go on the inside of the lens. So let me set this to be fully closed or fully open at the moment. The aperture control curve, when it's fully open, the little post here on this section, that little post should be at this point on the aperture control curve. So to get this in place, I'm going to hit the stop down lever and then slide the aperture control curve back through here in this orientation so that the higher section is over by the little post in this case. And with that said, I can just adjust this down because that'll make reattaching this slightly easier. And now I can reattach the 2 screws over here to tighten back down the aperture control curve. So what this curve is actually doing and how it's controlling the aperture and the diaphragm is that on the diaphragm mechanism back here, so on this piece we have the lever that actually opens and closes the diaphragm, and it's held fully closed by default by this little spring wire. So that lever or post on the diaphragm mechanism is going into the little pocket down here. So these 2 are going together, and that's what's actually controlling the diaphragm. So this bar in here, this black crescent bar, is controlling the diaphragm from, it's actually coupling the stop down lever and the aperture control ring to the diaphragm. So the stop down lever itself directly controls this crescent shaped metal piece and directly controls the diaphragm. And then the aperture control curve has this post resting against it. So the aperture control curve right here has this post. And as you rotate the aperture control ring back and forth, this little post moves along the aperture control curve and goes up and down along that curve, which also opens and closes the diaphragm. So those are the 2 ways that you can control the diaphragm. On this back piece, the areas that might be a problem are the springs over here. They could have broken, these little wire springs, or there could be friction in some of the bars moving back and forth in here, especially between this aperture or the diaphragm control bar in here that's moving, and then things like the bottom of the mounting plate, bottom of the lens body in here, and this little black thing, black bar in here that's on top of the curve that's moving back and forth. Oftentimes there'll be friction in there. So before we reattach this black ring here, part of the mounting plate, we have to reattach the inner part of the focusing mechanism here. So here's the focusing mechanism, and these 2 pieces have to be reattached. And the way that you line these up is on the focusing mechanism itself, there's this little section with 3 screws sticking out over here. That goes into the pocket down here on the mounting plate mechanism here. So these 2 should line up. And then while looking through, here I'm going to set this to be fully closed here. While looking through the back section here well, this is fully closed, so it's at 2.8 right, or fully open, so it's at 2.8 right now. On the aperture control ring, you should be able to line up through these little pockets in here in the aperture control ring, in these gaps. You should be able to line up the screw holes for the 2 sections that we're reattaching. So for the focusing mechanism and for the for the mounting plate itself. So these three should be lined up right now in this current orientation, and I'll get these attached first. And once those are reattached, now this fourth one, which is the one down here, once you go into the middle of the aperture control ring around 7 or between 5.6 and 8, this fourth hole should line up over here, and you can reattach the fourth screw as well. And then to complete the reassembly of the mounting plate on this back section, since we don't need access to anything back there anymore, we'll reattach this black ring that's part of the mounting plate. You can see that it has a slightly wider base section down here and then the top section. So that slightly wider section goes down on this, and it doesn't really matter where things are lining up with the three little slotted screws going around. Anywhere should be fine. Just make sure it's flat, and then I'll reattach these three screws going around and tighten this back down. And make sure the aperture control ring still moves freely at this point. Now we'll get the diaphragm back in place. So the diaphragm just slides into the inner part of the focusing mechanism here. And I already kind of described that it has to go, this little post here has to go down into the pocket that's controlled by both the aperture control ring and the stop down lever. So it has to go down there. So to line these up, I'll look through the back of the lens and just slide these together. And the diaphragm should go flat down into the lens. I'll put on the lens cap back here just to make it a little easier. And now you can see that I can move the diaphragm freely about in here. And this is one area where you can readjust how the aperture opens and closes. So let me just get started here by reattaching. We want to get this silver washer here in place into any of the four every other screws going around here. So get this brass washer in place just on two screws on the opposite sides to start with. Not really worrying about the rotation of the diaphragm at the moment, so I'm just going to get this started. And now you see that I've tightened this down, but moving the diaphragm or moving the aperture control ring back and forth, it's currently set to f22, but it's fully open. So to adjust this and to actually get it to be have the correct aperture for the aperture control ring, what I want to do is spin the intersection here, the actual diaphragm, around until I'm happy with how it's looking. So right now it's at f22, so I'm going to go to like the smallest aperture and then try tightening this down and just one of these screws and see, now that I move the aperture control ring, how that looks. So the two things I want to look for on this are that when the aperture is fully opens, it's set to fully open, none of the blades should be showing, and then when it's set to fully closed, it should be moving. There should be movement on the aperture control ring at every step in between. So we want to make sure that every click in here on the aperture control ring is actually moving the diaphragm slightly. So that actually looks pretty good in this current orientation. So I'll tighten these two back down and then reattach the other two screws here and here. To complete the back reassembly, now that the diaphragm is in place, we'll reattach this back optical piece. It just screws in place, and then you can use the spanning wrench in the two little divots to lock it down. So that has the back reassembly complete. Now we'll reattach the front optical piece as well. It also just screws in place, and you can also use a spanning wrench to lock this one down. And now this is where we actually want to zero the lens back to infinity, because at this stage we have the optics and the mounting plate all in place, and we just have to reattach the focusing ring at the correct position. So the focusing ring is going to slide on here, but the thing that has to line up for this is, you can see on the silver section in here, there's kind of a little notch thing over here, a screw, and that has to go on the focusing ring, there's a black bar on the inside here, and this is what's actually limiting how far you can focus in either direction. So this black bar is going around here, and then there's a gap in between here. So you want the gap to go over the little screw there so that it can, when you just rotating this freely, it's going between the two extremes of infinity and 0.3 meters. So right now, the lens is just at some arbitrary focusing currently, and to get it started here, I'm going to put the 3 screws back in place just in this current position. So going around here, the 3 screws with the little washers. And I'm not going to tighten these down fully, I'm just going to have them in there loosely because this is where you have to zero the lens back to infinity, and you'll have to adjust some things here. Okay, so now that I have the lens currently kind of put together, to actually zero it to infinity, what you would do is mount this lens in its current state on the camera and then find where it's optically focused in infinity. So you'd spin this all around. Maybe you would have to take off the focusing ring here and readjust it a little bit so you can go past the two extremes that are currently set. But you would spin this around until it's optically focused at infinity. So let's say it's like here at 1.3 currently, that's where it's optically at infinity. So I would loosen up the 3 little screws in here then, and then spin this around so that it's set to infinity on here, and then tighten this back down so that when it's set to infinity on the lens, it's optically focused at infinity as well. So that's how you would zero the lens back. It's not necessary to do that if you didn't actually remove the focusing ring. So during the disassembly, if you don't actually need to clean the focusing ring, you can skip the whole zeroing step by just keeping it on there, and that makes the reassembly a slight bit easier. Now I'll reattach the filter ring holder here, so this black piece, and it has gaps in the bottom section down here that go over the 4 screws that were already installed, so like that, and then the other 4 screws are used to reattach it to the lens body. And then to complete the reassembly, just reattach this plastic name ring. It just screws in place, and then you can use the pointed tip spanning wrench to lock it back down. Alright, so there's the Minolta MD Celtic 28mm f2.8 lens. Overall, almost identical internally to the MC W.Rokkor-X 28mm. There are a few differences, like it having 2 bars where the aperture control curve are, and some things like the diaphragm being held open. And I'm sure if you studied in more detail, you'd find some other subtle differences as well. But for disassembly and reassembly, they're almost identical. I did take them apart in slightly different ways in how I did the taking apart the mounting plate and the focusing mechanism, but you can use either strategy from either the disassemblies that I used on these lenses. It's just a matter of how you want to take apart the lens and what actually needs to be repaired. Unlike a lot of the other Celtic lenses, this is one that is actually repairable because it does use higher quality components. It's closer to the MD lens, and it has a higher quality design, closer to the MC W.Rokkor-X. The external components are a little bit cheaper. You can see that the name ring or the grippy ring on mine is kind of damaged in here, and the numbers are just like painted on. But besides that, it is a much more repairable lens than the 50mm and 135mm Celtics. So if you're going to buy a Celtic for repair, this is definitely the one to get.